Do your worst.
Okay. Digitization has so far mainly affected industries that deal with information goods, such as music, movies, books, news, and of course, communication. In the last 2 decades or so, we've seen an explosion of new products coming to the market, mostly because these new technologies and the internet have dramatically reduced production costs. We've witnessed how technology can disrupt business models of incumbent firms and also have seen the creation of entirely new markets, some of which are large. At the same time, we've also seen the rise of powerful intermediaries in these markets, such as advertising, social media, and online retail. With 3D printing, digitization might be soon arriving at scale in a range of other industries, those that produce physical goods. Today, we want to discuss the innovation policy implications for 3D printing with our guest, Professor Michal Gal from the University of Haifa. Okay, so today we want to discuss the competition and innovation policy issues of 3D printing with our guest, Michal Gal from the University of Haifa. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So before we dive into the policy aspects and the regulatory aspects of 3D printing, can you give us a heads up of what the promises of these technologies?
Well, 3D printing is what many people call a disruptive technology. Some people call it the revolution, the new industrial revolution. And if you think about some of the things that it enables us now to do, it's not surprising. Let me give you just a few examples of things that have happened with the technology in the last few years. So just a few months ago, researchers were able to print a live heart from live tissue using 3D printing. Before that, they were able to print kidneys and teeth, but a live heart is a new product. A round house, a 38 square meter round house, was printed using 3D technology in less than 24 hours, saving 70% of the cost. And these are just a few examples of what can be done. Of course, there's also the possibility of using home printers which can print smaller objects. One study indicates that you can save up to $1,000 by printing some of the products at home. And just to use a final example, Boeing is printing its wings and its engines using the technology, saving up to 20% of the weight of the plane and saving energy costs. So just a few examples of what the technology brings us.
Okay, great, thank you. So in your paper, you identify 4 main issues for competition policy and innovation policy. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you think are important issues with respect to 3D printing technology?
Yeah, okay, do you mean the characteristics?
Yes.
Yes. So there are indeed 4 main characteristics of 3D printing. I should say a word of caution because not all 3D printers are the same, and you cannot print everything, but the quality and the ink that is used now for 3D printing, the types of ink are growing exponentially. So this is actually a technology which is now flowering more and more. So we can talk about 4 characteristics. The first one is that you can print different parts together using different materials. So if up until now, if you wanted to combine, let's say, plastic and glass or titanium with other parts, what you needed is to produce the parts separately and then put them together. One of the things that the technology can do, and of course advanced 3D printers, is to use different and separate inks together. So that would be one change. And if you think about it, that also means that the sequence of assembly is no longer important because you can print the internal parts and the external parts at the same time.
Which of course has implications for production processes,
right.
the vertical relationships across firms and so on.
Exactly. So this is the first characteristic. The second is that 3D printers reduce asset specificity, which means that you can use the same printer to print a wide array of products, of course, depending on the availability of designs and the ink that that printer can use. So if you need different parts, or you want to play with different designs, you can actually do it without changing the production method or the production tool.
Okay? And so let me jump in here. So doesn't this also, I mean, I totally see your argument of reduction in asset specificity, but doesn't it also mean that further upstream firms, certain firms, for example, the producers of 3D printers or the producers of different materials that can be used as ink, sort of become more, or there's at least the risk that they become more powerful. And in that sense, there's although you sort of solved the Gaussian problem, there's new market power upstream.
You're very right. I mean, one of the concerns with the technology is that it will create different sources of market power. This can happen with any technology, but here, if we think about what might be the sources of new market power, you can. I think it's useful to think about three parts of the supply chain here. One is those who supply the designs, and it's not only the designers; it's also firms who create scanners or images for these 3D printers. So that would be one segment in which you might have market power if you have one firm which is much better than the others. Yeah. Another segment is the segment of the 3D printers themselves. And again, they do not necessarily all compete on the same market. So if I have a 3D printer which prints with titanium, I, of course, print very different objects than those which are in which the 3D uses, let's say, thermoplastics, okay? But it might be that in a certain segment of 3D printers, a firm will have market power. And the third segment is the ink, of course, as you suggested, because this is the raw material which is used to create the object, and it can be very diversified. It can be, for use for different printers. It can be titanium, it can be metal alloys, it can be glass, it can be clay, it can be cement, it can be many other things. So assume that one substance is better than the others. We find that, for example, it can bear more weight, or it's more stable over time, and whatever. So again, we might have a market power problem there. You're definitely right.
And so I cut you off.
No, it's fine. It's great.
About you were at the second of the four challenges.
Right. I mean, so we talked about the second. The third is that it might change with regard to some products. It changes the locus of design, because especially with home printers, consumers might become producers, and they might become designers, because if you have the software at home and you can play with the design and then you can print it on your own printer, the consumer becomes a producer or a designer. So some people call it a prosumer. I like the name. I think it's a fun one. And the fourth characteristic has to do with the fact that by using 3D imaging technology, you can actually take a physical object, take a photo of it, or take an image of it from all its sides, and reproduce it with a 3D printer. Okay? You can sometimes do it even with several pictures of the same object. That, of course, raises issues with regard to IP protection and to innovation, because copying of physical object has just become much easier than it was before.
And so I see the parallels to what we've seen in the early stages of digitization, with online piracy being a big threat or at least a big perceived threat to the media industries, for example.
That's correct, and I would say even more that, let's say the newspaper industry or the media industry, they have better means of protecting themselves than once you introduce or use you commonly use 3D printing. And let me just give you a few examples.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, let's assume that you're the New York Times. Okay, and you don't want people to then spread the article, even though it's in a digital format. It's really easy to spread it, right? You want people to pay, or at least not to view beyond a certain number of articles before they pay. The New York Times has control over the first viewing of the article. So if I go to the New York Times, I can actually, they can control whether I can see and how much I can read of the article. With a physical product, if I just see it, I take a picture of it, you have less control. Another thing is that New York Times can use, for example, digital watermarks to show where the article has where it was shared digitally, that you cannot do with a physical object that somebody just took a picture of and then created an image and printed it. And lastly, because of the different model, the New York Times, for example, can adopt an ad revenue model, which you cannot, which is not relevant when you have 3D printing. So in order to protect IP rights, the 3D would need to adopt other means. And there are some means that are already developed, although, for example, interesting, WIPO has put forward that it might even be suggested, it might even be welfare enhancing if some of these infringements were not followed or were not sued afterwards.
Because there might be derivative works, follow-up innovation that might be particularly welcome in terms of social welfare.
Exactly.
So what are the key policy takeaways from your paper? And where do we need to invest more in future research for it to become easier to make policy recommendations?
Right. Well, in my paper, I talk about three areas, three main ones. One has to do with whether the incentives for innovation are socially optimal. Because this is a technology that can bring a lot of good. It can also create a lot of harm. Okay? So we need to ensure that those instances in which it creates large benefits actually take place. And I think that the most, or maybe the strongest example is, of course, medical devices. Okay, so we talked about heart printing. Hearing aids today are printed by a 3D printer to fit the ear. Many of them, about 90% of them, are printed by 3D printers. Artificial bones, teeth are printed by 3D printers. Even medicines, personalized medicines, are printed by 3D printers in some instances. So I think, first of all, we need to ask ourselves whether the incentives are there. And if you think about it, we already invest public funds in that through universities. Universities, many of them are based on public funding. There's a lot of research which is going on in universities around the world with this innovative technology. But again, the question is this enough, or can we rely on the market? So this is the first kind of question that we have to ask.
So these are overlaps between consumer protection policy, between competition policy, between innovation policy. So lots of potential for policy to interfere with the markets or to set a market environment where firms sort of follow the right incentives.
That is completely correct. And because the technology can also do harm, just to give you an extreme example, you can print a gun using a 3D printer. And unfortunately, they actually work. And or let's take a less extreme example. Let's take a staircase that you print, and it's a faulty staircase. So somebody falls and gets hurt because of the material used, of the design used, of how it was applied in practice. So all of these issues have to be dealt with, or we have to think about how to deal with them through regulation. So once we set regulations, we also have to make sure that the balance between dealing with these harms and competition innovation, on the other hand, are social welfare enhancing. So this is the first part. Another has to do with access barriers that firms might erect to the entry of 3D printing, because we talked about it, that it's disruptive and it disrupts many existing industries. If you are, for example, let's take a very simple example, a producer of bolts, of nuts and bolts, now 3D printing enables you to do what is called assembly by design. You simply produce all the parts together. You don't need all these parts anymore. It, of course, affects vertical supply chains. It affects many suppliers. Not only that, the locus of the printing can change, so that if you print it sometimes offshore, now it might be more profitable to print onshore. So,
which of course has implications also for international trade, I guess.
Yes, definitely. International trade and domestic trade, and also sustainability, if you think about it. So firms might have, those whose business models are disrupted, have incentives, natural incentives, to stop the technology in its tracks. So again, we have to think about what kind of conduct might stop the technology and create all kinds of regulations that would deal with that. One example is what is known as killer mergers. These are mergers that in which firms buy a new technology and kill it in its tracks. They buy it not in order to use it, but in order to shelf it. And by buying it, they take it off the market. Once they take it off the market, of course, it limits competition and innovation. So that would be an example here. And the last part of the paper looks at power issues, market power issues, with players in 3D markets. What can we expect with regard to these firms in how they might use their market power, if they have market power, in order to limit competition from other firms in the market, and how we can deal with that.
And that's important because we consider 3D printing as a general, or kind of a general purpose technology, and therefore it deserves special attention, how we solve incentive problems for innovation in that market, right?
Right, this is definitely part of it. Another part of it is that the characteristics of the technology change some of the assumptions we sometimes make, or affect our ability to easily apply our existing laws. So it's not necessarily that we have to tweak our laws or to change them, but we have to be aware of the changes that the technology might bring about some of the justifications we use currently, or about the ability to apply some of the laws.
Okay, so lots of work still to do.
Yeah, exciting.
Thank you again for coming, and
thank you for having me.
Talking about this very interesting piece of research. We look forward to your further contributions.
Thank you very much.